Yeah, props.
Before things deteriorate further, let me call the special meeting of the City Council, a workshop on the budget to order. Will the clerk call the roll, please?
Mayor Johnston.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Francina.
Here.
Councilmember Blatz.
Here.
Councilmember Haney.
Here.
Councilmember Wyrick.
Here.
Okay, we have a quorum. I think it's already made the announcement, but the workshop we're going to do on the budget, I've got a couple of cards. If the people want to weigh in early, you get a couple minutes to do that, and then you'll have another shot at it during the regular meeting. Okay, Mr. City Manager, you want to kick things off?
I know we only have an hour to get into some big issues, so I will keep it very brief. But thank you, Mayor and Council. This is Budget Workshop 4 in this year's budget process. We have the budget hearing scheduled, our budget public hearing scheduled tonight as well, so I will try to keep this brief. We want to just reiterate kind of the big picture of where we're at. Again, I know we've talked about this at the last couple workshops, but the big picture is what we've tried to do this year is keep last year's service levels, but tell you what it's going to cost to do those same things this year. So we've still kept that in mind, trying not to reduce any of last year's service levels at this point. With that in mind, what our projections show is that our expenditures are anticipated to come in at $10.21 million this year. Our anticipated revenues are $10.16 million, which is a $52,000 funding gap this year. I do want to note that in the prior versions of the budget at the prior workshops, there was a $120,000 funding gap. As you noted in the staff report, we recommended several reductions to drop that down to a $52,000 funding gap. The recommendations essentially boil down to keeping the public works repairs maintenance budget in line with last year and not getting additional services there. That would be a $45,000 reduction from what was included in the budget, in the draft budget. We identified $15,000 worth of PEG eligible projects as well, and then $7,500 in various minor items to reduce that funding gap down to $52,000. Now, those were simple recommendations that we could make, keeping things in line. We also, with keeping things in line with prior year budget, we also identified some possible reductions that the city manager recommends based on the fact that we are facing a funding gap this year. Those three possible reductions are to postpone the historic report request for 1 year, which was a $15,000 request this year, to reduce the training budgets for the city $5,000. There is a little more to that one. We are recommending that we are going to consolidate all the various training budgets into one master training budget that would fall under the city manager's discretion, which will allow us to manage it a little bit better than we have in the past. So although it's a $5,000 reduction off of all of those combined, we are still going to be able to provide adequate and necessary training. And then we also are recommending a one-time code enforcement reduction of $5,000 that would drop the potential funding gap to $27,000. Now, the draft budget that you have that was provided to you shows the $52,000 budget gap, because we didn't want to assume that these possible reductions would be accepted, but if council accepts those, the funding gap would be reduced to $27,000.
Mayor, can we get some clarity on the code enforcement reduction?
Yes.
What does the $5,000 represent, and is there more there?
Yes. So right now we have budgeted $78,000, which is in line with what was budgeted last year. It's 30 hours per week of code enforcement services. We are looking at ways of doing that more efficiently and using less hours to get the same amount of work done. And I think we're seeing results from that in the last couple months. So I very easily could recommend a $5,000 reduction with confidence that we will be able to exceed last year's service levels with that reduction. I think that would be a decision that council could make is to reduce that further. And it would just come down to, like I said, we're reducing hours of service. So right now, what's in the budget is 30 hours a week. We would be reducing that further down.
Now, James, would that change the projected revenue from code enforcement by that reduction?
No, well, it wouldn't change the projected revenue. I actually would say that the actual, I'm trying to think of what it says, but the actual citation, the actual revenue that we've been bringing in through code has been increasing very much in the last couple of months, which is not the goal, but we haven't budgeted in an increase from what was previously.
It's an effective
seen.
tool, may not be a goal, but
Right.
it's an effective tool.
Right.
That's correct. And so we don't generally, we're not, because this is something, we want people to be in line with the code enforcement. So we don't want to be having the code enforcement actions, but if we have to, we will. So we don't aggressively budget that amount because it's very, very uncertain. And to do so wouldn't be in line with our conservative budgeting model that we have. So there's not a whole lot, we don't typically budget a whole bunch in there. That's really a little bit of gravy on top when we get those.
I wouldn't even know how you would budget for that, to be honest.
Well, yeah, and you don't want to become a bounty
Yes.
Right.
operation,
We
which,
want
a quota.
compliance in Ojai. We don't want, we don't want your money. We want
Right, but if
compliance.
if we're lowering code enforcement, we have to be cognizant of the fact it does usually bring in money, and it may not bring in as much money.
Well, I think,
Yeah.
I think your question is actually a great question, right?
Yeah.
I'm doing some simple math, and it looks like it's $78,000, where you're looking at $6,000 a month. So if you did no code enforcement in January and December, which are probably your slowest times of the year, period, there's another $6,000 it looks like that we could save. That's why I was looking at what's the win here, and if you're projecting taking 5, are you saying, okay, we're not going to code enforce in the month
That's
of January, or?
yeah. That's what we were getting at. We don't want to announce to the
Yeah.
public
if you want to
free rein-
violate it.
free
do it
rein
in-
these months, but that's in line with what we're discussing, is picking some weeks where we don't see code issues and strategically using those to identify some savings here.
So again, potentially there's more there.
Yeah. Yeah, we are being more aggressive on some things like leaf blowers and things like that recently. So I wouldn't want to go too drastic on it, but that's a pretty conservative. We could do 5,000 easy.
Well, also,
reduction.
it's interesting for me, I was just thinking that, I'm thinking code enforcement as being some basic enforcement going on in town, and I chose the winter months, and the reality is those 2 months from Thanksgiving through New Year's are probably STR months. So you would still need some form of code enforcement going on to actually manage that.
Yeah,
So,
spring and holidays is when we see the uptick in short-term rentals.
And point of clarification, the code enforcement is separate from the STR enforcement. This is strictly code enforcement going out for, the dealing with issues in the community that are not up to our codes. The STR enforcement is separate. That's along with our TOT auditing contract. So that would not impact
Great.
this number here.
Okay.
Okay.
But we have a history of not enforcing codes like we should for the
Right.
protection of people who are entitled to have that protection. So
Yeah.
I would not want to be trimming this back further until we show that we're actually getting a more efficient
Yeah.
program working.
Yeah, I agree.
So the potential funding gap would be $27,000. Now, council obviously could choose to take any of those suggestions or none of them, and that would leave us back at the $52,000 gap that's in the budget materials before you. And then just quickly, a couple other quick points, as we've mentioned this before, but the reserve policy of the city is a 50% general fund operating budget reserve goal, which would be about $5.1 million. We're at about we're projecting that by the end of this fiscal year, we'll be at around 3.59. So it will be some, minor growth towards that goal. Obviously, the goal would be to keep building those reserves quicker and get to the 50% goal. The one note, obviously, is if we adopt the budget with a $27,000 or $52,000 funding gap, that would ultimately reduce the reserves. But the recommendation before you was to adopt that budget with direction for staff to return at the mid-year with some additional recommendations to try to address that. So the goal would be to not end up in the negative, but it's just by adopting a budget with a funding gap, there's that possibility.
Mayor, I had a question.
Bill?
When are we anticipating the first report from the TOT audit?
So Rudy would have that date.
The auditors are currently working on those audits. They're in the process. It's probably about a 2-month process to be done. And then approximately 1 month after that to get all of it wrapped up with the reports. So approximately 2 to 3 months from now, we should be getting the first reports.
Thank you.
Now, another just quick overview is one of the other big questions is how we're going to allocate the community organization funding. The budget before you includes $110,000 for community outreach. Obviously, we received, as the staff report noted, $273,000 in requests. And since that staff report came out, there was also an update from Clean Power Alliance that we're also going to see a rate increase as well. So we've kind of included that. It's ultimately a $23,000 total increase, although we had budgeted $8,000 of that, so it's another $15,000.
Mayor, before we discuss the community organizations, can we look at the commission funding? And on the next page, it's just a smaller amount of money. I think it might be easier to just go through that and decide what we want to do there, and then go back to the.
Okay, but do we want to do this first to get the presentation to us and then go back and pick it up rather than?
I'm sorry.
Okay, let's see if we can.
That actually is the last slide, so good timing, but the last slide was just to show the commission funding and that in general, it's in line with last year's budget amounts. The Arts Commission requested a little bit more for their grants and awards projects, but we've just budgeted it at the same amount as last year. The HPC has their operating budget, and then they requested the historic reports, and so those were not included. Those were the ones that we identified as a possible reduction. So those are the two numbers that don't match up on this chart between what was requested and what was budgeted. So that is the last informational slide. The next 3 slides are basically the 3 questions before us at this time, which is, do we want to accept the budget with the $52,000 or the $27,000 funding gap or make any adjustments? What community organizations to fund and what amounts? And the CIP question, which I can address that when we get to it. There's a couple of CIP projects that have been requested at various meetings to be added. So we've identified some offsetting projects if we want to swap them out. So that's all I have.
Okay.
I just want to clarify one thing. The HPC historic reports would then happen next year. Is that correct?
So our proposal is to postpone those 1 year.
1 year. Okay. And there was something you said that if something comes up, it can be handled.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that is a point is that
But I want to point, just to interrupt real quickly
Yeah.
to respond. We have yet to give direction on this as a council.
Uh-huh.
And traditionally, we don't engage in these kinds of activities without it first coming to council when we direct that it be done. So this question of whether we're going to do the historic report hasn't come to council yet.
I know, but the idea is that if we don't budget the 15,000, then it doesn't just disappear, it just gets postponed.
right. And then I think the second point was that if somebody came in and proposed projects that we're going to change the look of those buildings, that we'd have the ability through our just design review processes
Yeah.
to address that. So
Yeah.
Well, also, more importantly, is HPC needs funding, they can come back at any time and ask or request for funding for a report.
Yeah.
So there's no reason necessarily to fund it on the front end, when they can come at any time to council and request a
Okay.
funding mechanism for a report.
Good, yeah. So, that's what I know.
Okay. Let's take public comments, and then we'll deliberate, okay? And if there's no objection to that, I have a card from Andy Gilman with Brian Akins on deck.
Hello, everyone. I came to speak in support of the line item for the Chamber of Commerce. And the reason for that is I believe that that is one of the central things that will create a sustainable model for Ojai going forward. And I'm not saying anything you don't know. We have a school-age population in decline. We need more jobs that are professional paying, not tourist jobs. And obviously, we need affordable housing, but it seems to me that's one of the central tenets. I know a lot of you have already met Tiffany, the incoming OUSD superintendent. So it seems to me this is the right track to create an environment where all three of those things can be moving in the same direction. And then what I would say is then it would fall to you and the Planning Commission to then make it encouraging for these businesses to come here that we would want to be here, including my former employer, somebody like Behavioral Science Technology, who did employ a lot of us that ate at the restaurants during the week, and we could afford to live here and all that. So I hope you will consider that. Thank you.
Just one comment, Mayor. Andy, I want to just publicly commend Chautauqua for.
I was going to speak second in the public
Well, I
meeting.
just
but
want
I'm
to.
happy
I want to thank you for in advance then.
Okay.
Because it is relevant to the budget discussion, because I'm hoping things may come out of that series of discussions on impact.
Yep.
That may help gel a little more focus on the way the school system and chamber can work together
Thank
with
you.
the city.
I would like that too.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Brian?
Okay, representing two organizations, I see I'm on both screenshots that are up there. As you can see, I and my fellow board members are supporting the Ojai Valley Museum. This, by the way, is artwork that was done by Brian Berman, 3D printed for an exhibit that we did. We came to the council asking for $60,000. What you have is an updated sheet showing the May financials. We met on those at 10 o'clock this morning. If you're wondering why two of those items are slightly higher, publicity is Constant Contact is $714. That was due this month. That came up. The office supplies is stationery envelopes and toner cartridges, which raised that up. So we didn't do that on purpose. It just happened. So again, we're here. I'll be here in the next meeting. Half of our board is here supporting this. 1 minute up. Now switching over to the other slide. The historic resource reports is actually half of a historic resource report. That is the primary function of the HPC, and that we're working with the staff on is the historic downtown district assessment on whether we're gathering data on that. We have two ad hoc committees that are working on that with the staff. We figured that as a rough guess, nobody had any idea that it might be 30,000 altogether, so we just sliced it in half and put half in this year and half in next year. So I hope that answers questions on what the historic resource report is. So I'll be around, as I said, for the next meeting. Thank you all very much, and support the museum. Thank you.
Okay, those are all the cards I have, so we'll bring it back to the council for deliberation. I guess my recommendation, or I would move that we adopt the budget as submitted by staff, and that we direct staff to come back for an October revise, looking at some of these additional requests and how well we're progressing, and the council could then consider additional expenditures. But right now, for us to go beyond the 27,000, I'm not sure. I think, my preference is for the, for us to stay in the 100% option, which is going to cost us a few dollars more, but there's a way to cover that. So anyway, I would move.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, so we have a motion to to adopt
So-
the budget is,
Just to clarify, this is the workshop.
right,
The
yeah, but
actual
this is a
adoption would come-
recommendation for the public hearing.
Yeah, so I would,
Second of recommendation?
yeah, that's fine, exactly.
Greg, okay.
Quick point, can I add clarification? You said, saying that you're recommending the $52,000 deficit budget, or including these cuts,
The
which would bring it
27.
down to 27?
Yeah. That's that's what I concurred with. My understanding was that-
You concurred with what?
That you were recommending the 27,000 version.
Well, 27,000, but also that we accept the fact that we're going to pay $15,000 more in some fashion, and there is a way to do that. So,
Yeah, okay.
so that, anyway, that just for purposes of discussion in the workshop. So
Yeah,
now I guess we can kind of go through. Randy, you had some.
Yeah, and I
I
was
just-
concurring with that. I had
well-
some thoughts on it, but, you know.
Yeah, well, first of all, Mayor, thank you. I just wanted, when we talked about this a couple weeks ago and asked staff to come back and actually give us some additional information. So they did, and they found $25,000, which I think was exceptional. So thank you for that. And again, pointing out some of the other areas that we can, if we choose to, down the road. The only thing we really didn't get into was, I don't know if we want to do it here or if we want to do it in the actual budget meeting.
It's only 6:30.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking about some of the discretionary funding that we need to do down the road, 6 months from now, finding out how much additional money we have. Did we want to create a priority list as to how we would use that money? Or do we just want it to come back to us as as-need basis? So in other words, we took the $15,000 from the HPC. We said we're going to fund HPC down the road. When they come back to us with a request, or that's what I'm trying to say is, or am I not being clear here?
Well, could I speak to that? My opinion on the historic district is that our protocol, I thought, was before staff time's involved in something like looking at an historic district, it first comes to council as to whether or not we want to look at that direction. And so I'm a little confused about using staff time for something like that before council's decided that's a direction we want to use staff time for.
Okay.
And so what I think the appropriate thing is we should deliberate on whether we want to formally explore the idea of an historic district downtown or not before we invest either in-kind time or actual dollars. So that would be my approach, is that's the kind of thing we should.
Well, I think I'm saying the same thing,
It's not something that should just kind of happen as a request
Right.
after staff time's engaged. It should be coming to us, is that a direction we want to look at? I have some opinions about that but aren't appropriate to voice now, but we did that, for example, with other things like that in the past, and I think that was the protocol before we start using staff time on these kinds of initiatives. They should come to us for direction first,
Right.
you know?
Okay. Well, then I'll wait till the next budget. Just for the full budget discussion, I'll have a couple
But
comments.
yeah, I mean, I don't know if that was an
No, I'm
appropriate
agreeing with you. I
response.
think we're saying the same thing. I'm just saying
Yeah.
it.
But that's how I feel about it, because I don't think we should be engaging in a lot of investment of something and if we haven't set it as a policy goal first.
Okay.
I have a question now.
Right.
If it's 6:30 and we vote on this now, then are we going to decide in a half hour how we're going to spend the 110,000 on community groups? And we're all sitting here. Why don't we just make some decisions instead of just saying, all right, we agree with the numbers, but let's make the hard decisions because we got to start figuring out at some point. And the first item on the agenda, essentially after the consent, we can take it as the first item after the Pledge of Allegiance is the budget. So we can move it right into 701 if we want. But yeah, I think we're all, I don't know if we need to vote on the motion for 110,000 and our $27,000 deficit, but
He's telling us we can't.
So yeah, you can make a recommendation at this stage. You
right, and then
can't
we
vote
on
until
it
the
at
7
7.
o'clock.
Okay. So then wouldn't it be more appropriate? At this point, shouldn't we start getting into the nitty gritty and start figuring out where that 110 is going to go? Or because are there any other cuts? Are there any other proposed cuts that we have that anybody else has? And then if we don't, then can we start figuring out how we're going to allocate that? Okay.
I'll make one comment. I think it's interesting that the Clean Power Alliance rate increase is put into community organizations as opposed to the increase in the utility budget.
I think that was a timing thing, right?
Yeah.
In all fairness,
was just
that's
a way
because
to-
it happened since the last meeting.
It happened on, I think, Thursday or Friday, we got the
Yeah.
final numbers, so it's just a way to call it out without
I understand.
talking about the whole utility budget.
Yeah, that's not a fun line item. I'd prefer if that wasn't there.
Yeah, ultimately, it will be in the utility
Utility
budget.
budget.
Yeah.
Only in the utility budget.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right, but it does compete with that.
Yeah.
Because
That's correct.
actually, the leadership for the Clean Power Alliance, I think, originated with the Green Coalition. And the reason for the council appropriating money to the Green Coalition is to support activities like this
Right.
for the environment. So it seems like it could be in either place.
That's
Well,
okay. I
we
understand.
can blame the Public Utility Commission is the right place to lay the blame.
Exactly.
That'll be the answer most of the time. Well, then I'm, at your discretion, Mayor, I think should we start having a discussion on how that 110 is
Sure.
going to get
Well,
chopped
why
up?
don't we think of this as, rather than a recommendation, we're just taking sort of a straw poll now as to where, and having a conversation about how that
I think
money
so.
is to be allocated.
We're still going to take public comment and everything
Sure,
at 7,
right,
so.
correct,
Yeah, Are we taking public comment at the next phase?
at the public hearing.
But not,
So
We
this
are
is
now
a
deliberating
this is a
amongst ourselves.
preliminary discussion
This-
on
Yeah.
community organization funding.
And this is the workshop amongst the council, and the topic that Ryan's suggesting that we address now is the community organization as to how that would be allocated.
Obviously, that's our biggest problem right now, and then, and unless we have any other revenue stuff, I mean, there's some stuff I think could be in there, but it's all I know we want to be as conservative as we can, and I also don't know if since we have this time, since we are talking about the budget, we can potentially talk about if we're going to try and increase other revenue, has been discussed during this process a number of times, from sales tax to TOT to other stuff. And how long down the road whether that's going to help us at all make ends meet for this particular budget.
Right, well, unfortunately, they won't help ends meet for this budget, but I
Yeah.
do agree with you that if the council wants to spend more money, they at least have to be prepared to find new sources and recommend to the voters, because a lot of this requires a vote of the public. We don't have a lot of latitude as to how we generate revenue, and this needs to go on the ballot. If there are things here, like community development, which is an ongoing and large expense, needs to be supported by something. So even if it's not, a special tax, but a general commitment
Yeah.
to using it.
Well, Matt, do we have any problem talking about that? Obviously, we can't make
No.
a decision on it, but is there any problem talking about that
Yeah,
in general?
you
terms?
couldn't vote to put a tax on the ballot, but you could certainly discuss the revenue options tonight, and you could even make the direction, come back with a tax of some sort next
Okay.
time.
And if we were to pass a sales tax or transit occupancy tax, that would need to go to a general election, is that correct?
It would depends if it's a general tax or a special tax.
Assuming it's a general tax for purposes of tonight.
general tax, then it has to go to the November 2020 election unless there's a unanimous vote that there's a fiscal emergency.
Right, and then that would be the same election where we're currently anticipating having the cannabis tax on the
Correct.
ballot. And is there any savings by having two measures on the same ballot, or is it, if you have two, does it cost is it the cost times two, or is it?
It's not times two. There's a slight savings for the second measure because they're already putting together a city item.
Okay.
I don't know the exact numbers, but it's not a full 2x on the election costs.
Okay,
Can I make a very minor revenue inquiry that doesn't involve an election?
of course.
Did we ever get any kind of a feeling, estimate, thought of what we might get reasonably, modestly on rent of the outdoor dining in the plaza area?
No, we have that on our list to bring back in the next couple of meetings, but we haven't started projecting it out. I think a lot of it's going to come down to what do we feel is a reasonable rate that
That's what
everybody will
I
agree
asked.
on.
Okay,
Yeah.
just curious.
Yeah.
All right. That was a very small amount, but I thought I'd just ask it.
Yeah, I think there are some, unfortunately, it's all small stuff, and we're trying to budget accordingly to be
And
conservative.
there was also the library tax issue, too.
Yeah. Did-
Where we're just a cost of living.
volume in here
increase.
just
Yeah,
goes
all of a sudden, a lot of
substantially
feedback here. Yeah,
what did you just say?
there was a lot of
The
feedback.
volume, the feedback just got
Volume
really
started
bad.
going up.
So,
But, I
Yeah,
mean,
we're sounding better.
There also was we were told that the library, county is going to be asking more money for library. We haven't had a cost of living adjustment in
Right.
like 20 years or something. And, again, small amount, but maybe coordinating with the county to just do a cost of living tax increase for library support as well, that kind of thing.
Okay.
I'm just saying sometimes smaller things are okay, and not, you
Yeah.
don't have to go with just the big stuff.
Okay.
Mayor,
Randy? yeah.
did we ask staff to bring us back those items that they felt that they could increase funding to the general fund from? You know, like I'm thinking our Sterling contract might be a source. I'm looking at our Libby Tennis contracts as a source. We talked about programming at the park facility itself as another source of increased revenue. So did you put together anything, James?
No, we didn't, and the reason why we haven't done any of that is because at this point it is speculative, where we wouldn't want to budget based on that.
Right.
But those are all things we're going to bring back in coming weeks and could have an impact, but we don't want to assume that we're going to have that.
And those are also some of the things that we talked about coming back in 6 months and actually having a mid-year review of the budget. And so if we did make any changes in those sources
Right.
of additional revenues, we would be seeing that to a degree.
And some of those recommendations particularly are on our list to follow up at the 6 month.
And the reason I asked about the TOT audit was, remember, I think, saw a significant increase in sales tax collections after doing a sales tax audit. And I'm really kind of interested to see what might happen. For the first time, we've done a TOT audit now in how many decades? Decades, okay, all right.
And none of these anticipated potential increases are anywhere, they're not budgeted, right? As income, right? Rudy?
Well,
Oh, that's what you said. Yeah, I know, I just wanted to.
There are jurisdictions that use what they call an October revise, which
Yeah.
means that, we're closing out this fiscal year. We're just barely into the next fiscal year. The finance department understandably is a bit reluctant to project things without enough data. But by October, you start to get a picture of either the revenues are picking up, the staff's had an opportunity to see what they can do for what they call euphemistically revenue enhancements, which means actually collecting some of the fees that maybe should have been collected all along, or some adjustments to those fees that we can do without going to, user fee as under, was it Prop 218? That is possible, and that taking a look at that in October would then say, okay, now what might we be able to afford of the things that?
Right. I think that's what I was talking about, that wish list or that a priority list as to how any additional revenue, how we would, what are our priorities today, but that may change again in a month, so.
Further comments?
I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no,
I'm-
not at all.
So, community organizations. we
Yeah, I
wanna
mean,
tackle one?
is
We
it
wanna
that
tackle
everybody's
two?
just afraid to start this process? Is that what I'm getting?
Listen, I jumped
Nobody
in.
wants to jump in the cold water first, or what?
No,
You waiting for the new guy to do it?
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, this is a test of your
Toast
political
along.
acumen. Go ahead.
Well, I'll jump in if you're looking for someone to jump
It's like
in.
detente around here.
Yeah, Bill
Okay.
will always jump in first.
Yeah,
There we go.
well-
Yeah, that's usually, that's what you're supposed to do, Bill.
Well, I just want to say, I wanted to thank the museum for bringing out the numbers in terms of the, between the visitor center, which is a designated municipal function, and it's a designated municipal museum. The numbers obviously are very healthy in terms of the number of people that are involved, and I just, I just think that given the central function, both as a visitor center and the fact that, as I heard Mark Lewis speak so eloquently on Sunday, they are kind of the definers and archivists of our identity in some respect. And that's a very important function for us. So I just think, just to start out, that it makes sense to continue the museum funding at the level they were last year, given the productivity and impact they have in the community. I think that's that's where I am, anyway.
I
on the
support,
museum.
I support those comments wholeheartedly. Yeah.
And I think in terms of, given that things are maybe a little tight, I don't know how desperately bad the phone system is, but that is the kind of thing that might fit into a contingency where if the money becomes available, then it's a priority.
Right.
Well, if we look at the museum and we assume we're gonna spend 60 there, then we're left with 50. And there's very little that we have left to be able to do
I'm
with it.
just expressing my opinion.
I know, I'm with you. I mean, I'm just talking out loud. And I will say this, I am very passionate about the need in this community for some sort of economic development and a new place for people to start when they want to build their business or they want to come to town. As I've said many times, I spent time with Scott Eicher, the former CEO of the Chamber, and we sat down, and it only took us about 10 minutes to come up with about 25 businesses that were great for Ojai that did not have the cooperation of the city, and for whatever reason, it didn't work. And I am passionate and committed to not allowing that to happen again. The Chamber of Commerce used to operate the Visitors Bureau, the Tourism Improvement District, and they received funding under that. The rug was kind of pulled out from underneath them when that funding disappeared, and that was money that came in through an additional surtax on the TOT tax. I think that those services are important. I think they should be directed less towards tourism and more towards local economic development, which is the proposal we have in front of us. And I'd like to make sure that we are going to be able to fund that to keep the Chamber as a partner for the city and to move forward. Now, how we're going to do that, I want to think of whatever creative ways we do. I think that we as a board, as a body, have to take a little responsibility for the fact that the rug got pulled out from under the Chamber where their funding was before. If that means we need to have a serious conversation about increasing the transit occupancy tax to the level it was before with that extra tax that was there, then I think now's the time to do it. But I think it's important that we, even if we can't fund all of this at this moment, that we need to get as much of it funded as we can and get these services working. The Chamber's already providing free services for the city that are very valuable. And I don't know how we're going to make all this work, but if we are going to, keep the funding at the museum the same, then we're going to have to find out where everybody can take cuts. But I look at the value added for the Chamber operations as the most valuable thing back to the city. I think the museum is incredibly important, but as far as a return on investment, I think that there's a legitimate return on investment for the Chamber of Commerce versus the other things. They just don't have an actual money back to the community, money back to the city potential. I also think that some of the job description that the Chamber's taking on may be able to eliminate services that we either have to pay for in-house or that are already overstaffing people, so there's some value for that. So I'm inclined to try and, fund the full Chamber ask, but then we would already be well over without any of the other asks to be able to do that. I would assume that the Chamber has some ability, some flexibility in what they'd be willing to take, but what are the other creative options that we can do in this situation? Can we, partially fund it for 6 months and then come back and come back with a date certain that we're going to try and rebudget that, everything we can? I mean, some of these other, I know we kind of said the same thing with the 15,000, but.
Well, you asked a question about being creative. I have a thought.
Yeah, please.
If it, you
Wasn't filibustering, I
Yeah,
promise.
yield and that is just to be honest, I've had some discussions with our city manager on this, and that, we have an unfilled deputy position right now. And one option is for, outside of community organizations, is certain contract services that need to be done to cover some of the vacancy functions that we have right now. That would be outside of community organization where specific contract services could be done by the Chamber directly for the city manager support, is one thought I've had.
Yeah. Now, what would that be, like on an ad hoc, as needed kind of?
Yes.
James, what kind of services do you envision for that? I assume that's coming through you to Bill.
Yeah. So there's some simple things that I think you're referring to. One of the things is the deputy or the assistant to or deputy, whatever the title ends up being. That's gone back and forth, but that person attends the monthly EDC VC meetings and does spend some time following up on those things. That I'd anticipate that position will probably be vacant. I'd love to fill it as soon as possible, but there's probably 6 to 8 weeks. So if we were to identify some of those tasks and try to figure out some savings, and that could be something that I could bring back separately, or we can come back with some analysis on, but that could be an option. There's some time spent on economic development, but obviously not as much as what this would eventually lead to.
Yeah.
I think an example that's important for our economic development is the broadband initiative that EDC-VC is the representative for this region at. And I haven't had time to follow up as I should on that. You haven't had time. There's a number of initiatives and applications that could be put together for that kind of thing that nobody has the time to do right now.
So the vision be entering into like a separate contract with the chamber to provide the services on just that one thing?
Or, yeah,
I mean,
a series.
I mean, maybe a base funding, but then
a specific purpose contract services is the thought.
Now, where out of the budget would that come, James? Is that in a different portion of the budget, so it would?
Well, so I think the way that well, so I guess A would be any funding from here.
Yeah.
That we identify. And then the second part, what I was saying is there may be a small period of time where we may have some quote unquote salary savings from that assistant position. But I would like to, I don't want
It's
to
just a
promise to
creative
not
thought.
fill it for 4 months because
Right.
we'd love to fill it sooner. So
Just a creative thought.
Yeah.
You asked.
And one of the things that I hope we keep in mind is there's a difference between, like capital investment or one-time contributions versus an ongoing requirement, which becomes then dependent upon the city budget, and it's a lot harder to change a yes to a no than a no to a yes. So we would need to, I think what Bill's talking about at least is isolating what kind of services that may or may not continue. But if this ends up being a way in which to sort of subsidize the operation of any of the community organizations, then they become dependents of the city, and then you have yourself a real problem in the future
Right.
in cutting that. So,
Well, that's part of this discussion
Right.
tonight, is there's some entities that are dependent on on our funding that, or might be in the, might not be happy when this is all said and done tonight. Another aspect of all this, of this creativity was the OTED that we had and removed. In the OTED, we have to ask Matt, if it could have been used to fund some form of EDC operation, as well as some of the things that we're talking about right now. I know you had brought up actually raising the TOT tax. That's one aspect of it, but I remember when the OTED discussion was happening, we had looked at all the different services that we felt we could pull back from that funding source and actually utilize in the city. So Matt, I'm not sure if that's one of those.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. So if the transient occupancy tax is raised, that is general fund money that can be spent on anything.
Right.
If a new OTID is put in place, that's a new Ojai Tourism Improvement District, it has to be spent on activities and expenditures that further the goal for which it was collected. The goal for which it was collected is to increase the number of visitors to the valley. So as long as you can draw that nexus between the economic development efforts that would be funded by it and bringing more visitors to the valley, and thus more transients to the hotels that pay the assessment, then it's legal and consistent with the funding source.
Well,
So
but that's not just bringing visitors to the valley, it's bringing people in to fill, as I think our previous manager of the chamber said, putting heads in beds, I think was their slogan. The law, to be able to have that kind of a tax without a vote of the people, had to be a specific purpose, and it was narrowed.
Well,
and that is correct. It's narrow to the folks.
Right, and I'm not suggesting we bring that back. What I'm doing is saying is that was part of what the discussion was in the past. So the question would be, if the OTED could fund traffic studies and parking studies and air quality studies, that's money that generally comes from the general fund to perform those tasks, which in turn puts money back into the general fund because another source of revenue is paying for them. That was what we were trying to achieve in that last OTED discussion that obviously we didn't convey strong enough. But, so that's just another way of doing it.
And certainly the kinds of traffic studies that were discussed towards the end with the last OTID were able to be funded by it had it survived, because that would have developed information to use
Tourism.
in assessing the better ways to get, quote, more heads in beds.
And also the impacts, the negative impacts or positive impacts of tourism in the community. That's the whole idea.
And,
tonight.
for example, how to facilitate a better functioning transit system which allows more people
Right.
to more effectively utilize existing hotels,
Right.
which promotes their goals and the goals for which the assessment was imposed. Spending it on funding economic development efforts tied to non-tourism businesses, though, would be beyond the power of an OTID.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say the T-bid The T-bit is dead. Rest in peace.
T-bit is dead, yes.
And nobody here is trying to bring it back. I want to make that very clear. Nobody here was trying to bring it back.
Don't get excited.
But
yeah.
what I do think is that, as the mayor said so eloquently, is that some of these are annual, reoccurring things. We don't want to put things. Well, then let's look at this differently. What I would say is we need to fund this Chamber of Commerce operation because it's so needed until November of 2020, which is 1.5 fiscal years, where we should have something on the ballot that's going to
Which
increase our
was kind of
taxes
my point.
between cannabis and maybe either a sales tax increase or a TOT tax increase, which is what I'm much more favorable of. And I'd like us to think about that in the context of this and have at least, say, all right, then if we're going to maybe fund a little bit more with the anticipation that we're going to look at that later, or how we're going to be able to do it. If we have to raise the debt number a little bit higher or the shortage. And to make it clear, you're not using the credit card to make the budget. It's about how much money we're saving, not how much money we're spending. We have a reserve that we try and keep at 50%. When we talk about going into that, we're not keeping the full 50% potentially. It's not that we are going into debt as a community. So this is money we do have. It just exceeds
Okay,
the reserve.
but for clarity, what it means is we're not living within our current income.
Right, and
yeah.
but I want to make sure people don't think we're taking we're selling bonds or something to raise that
Right,
money.
yeah.
And any kind
That's
of
all.
debt borrowed by the city, if you allow me to interject, does require voter approval.
Right. But I would say that if we're looking at fiscally 18 months of Chamber of Commerce operations, we should look at it that if at that time there's no passing of the TOT, then that would be kind of a direct line that we probably wouldn't fund it anymore, and they'd have to be aware of that.
Well, I have not seen a business plan for what that means to fund the chamber. Is this buying services from the chamber, or
Yeah, it's in
or
the
is it,
packet.
or is it? Well, yeah, but it doesn't.
Well, the idea that's been going on, that I've been working on, as well as with Mr. McClary when he was here, as well as with Jamie Fleming from the chamber, is that the chamber would take over some of the leading edge and development for economics that we've seen so many times where business entities, new or expanding, have come into City Hall and been completely turned off by what the information was they received, and they ended up deciding not to continue their investment in our community, even though we look back and go, well, why didn't that work? They were good for Ojai, they had all the right ideas, and this constant reoccurring theme, that's what the chamber could provide, is a front line of where someone comes in, they don't have to be directed to the staff in City Hall. They can go to the chamber, they can discuss these ideas, they can vet them in a business community, they can see who's supportive of it, and rather than coming to City Hall first, they can bring their coalition or bring their support and understand the dynamics of the economics in town better, as well as providing recruiting and looking for businesses that may fit in town. We have a lot of corporate retreats that happen in Ojai, and one thing the chamber wants to do is capture some of those as potential businesses that may want to move to Ojai and may want to set up roots here. So these are the services that they provide in addition to what James was saying about some of the specific stuff that we could have specific line items, and obviously barring Jamie and the chamber being on board with that, making sure that it's stuff that they're willing to do. What they proposed is to really be the ambassador of quote unquote the brand of Ojai, but to make sure it's being properly managed and that people are seeing it for all the wonderful things that are here, but then hopefully on this economic development side, really making sure that we don't have another decade of those 25 lost businesses that we wish we had back.
Okay. All right. So at this point, we're just in discussion, correct? Okay, so, and you've all advocated for the various organizations. So
Not all of us.
Okay,
Yeah.
but I just want to say that the Ojai Valley Green Coalition is the only organization that is really looking at the climate emergency issues that we're faced with. And if we don't address that, all of these other things are mute. They're not, they are the foundation, they are there's many ways to measure. And you said that, I think, Councilmember Blatz, you said that they're the only ones that are going to bring an economic return, right? Those were your words. But there's there's other ways to measure whether we're getting a return, and that's the quality of life. That goes beyond the immediate economic return. So my question is, how can we fund everything that's on this list? How can we? Because if we think something is important, we always find a way to fund it. If something is important enough, we find a way to fund it. That's just how it is.
So the answer to that is we cut services or we use reserves. Those are the two
Yeah.
options.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Exactly.
so
Well,
Or we repeal the city policy on what is believed by prior city councils as a responsible way to budget.
right.
It's not just going into the savings account to fund things that seem important. It's living within the current income.
Well, what is our reserve consistent? Is that what all, I mean, do all cities, are they about 50%, or is that?
No, they
More
do,
or less,
no,
or-
because all cities are not the same. And in the case of Ojai, because we are so dependent upon, tourism, that we have to be very careful when if you have a more diverse economy, some things are up while other things go down. But if our economy goes down, then you have to have a way to segue into the recession or whatever it is, and keep the police services and that sort of thing going. So 50% in a small city is not too much. The city of Port Hueneme had like a $16 million reserve at one time, and almost
Not anymore.
Like in 3 years, they were down to almost zero because they had to drain it.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what we've been trying to avoid. We do have a resolution on the books that say how we're supposed to do that. We haven't paid really close attention, but generally, we've been doing the right thing and moving in the right direction, and this
Well,
is the same.
Ryan, I used to think the same thing, that was kind of, the reserve meant reserve. We could use it for whatever we felt was a necessity, but you're looking at $163,000, Souza, to fund everything, along with, does that include, James, the deficit of the additional 27,000? So you're talking almost $200,000 that I'm hearing that we may want to fund out of the reserve, and I'm just not sure if I could support that either. Maybe a couple of years ago I would, but not anymore. So I think we have to live within our means, and we have to take a look at some of the entities that are providing services, maybe scale them back to what they can actually achieve, and try and take some of that money and move it over to fund something that we would like, because doing anything with the chamber is an experiment. So I don't necessarily want to start with a $100,000 experiment,
Yeah.
but I might be willing to start them out with $25,000 or $35,000. So then where do we find that? I look at the Green Coalition's budget, and over half of it is for the garden back here, which, if I had to move money around, I could say we could put the garden on hold, because there actually is really no plan for it. I'd like to see some form of creation of an ad hoc committee from the community to actually get that development going. So I could see, I think the Green Coalition had about $18,000 in some of the work that they wanted to provide that they do well with, give them maybe a little more funding for some overhead, and then take 25 of their 50 and actually allocate it to the chamber to get them started, until James can either figure out what we can do with some salary savings, and/or the mid-October term budget review, and see if what other monies have come in. So I think there's ways of
Okay,
doing it.
guys,
I need to be
it is,
clear on what
just a second,
Randy
this
just-
is a workshop, and it is now 7 o'clock, and the city council meeting will start, and then we can continue the deliberation following the public hearing. So we have
Can we have
another,
a 1-minute break?
okay, we have been a request for 1-minute break.
It's our third meeting.
Yeah, okay. Okay, we'll
Round
wait.
3, yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna close the workshop now, at 7, and